All right, well, we had just started chapter 3, verse 1 last week. See how great a love the Father has bestowed on us that we would be called children of God, and such we are. For this reason, the world does not know us because it did not know Him. We discussed how the use of us being called God's children, identified as God's children, has a particular meaning, and it's something that should grab our hearts to understand that the Creator of all that is views us as His children. And we discussed that there is nothing a parent wouldn't do for their children, and our God has certainly demonstrated that in our lives through the death of His Son and the hope of salvation that we have through Him. So moving on to verse 2. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when He appears, we will be like Him, because we will see Him just as He is. What's John talking about here? When he says, we don't know yet what we will be. And then he talks about His appearing. What do you think John is referring to here?
The resurrection.
Yeah, the resurrection. I think that's the right conclusion to draw from this, that we're going to be different in the resurrection. In what ways are we going to be different? His spiritual being, whatever that means, right?
We're going to see Him as one, I believe, as one unit, so to speak.
Right.
We will see Him as the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit as one. And so, there's so much in that verse that should give us hope, give us excitement. To just say that one day we're faithful to God, and there's just something awesome that's waiting for us. And
it's going to be a fascinating journey. Y'all ever think about the nature of matter? So I heard a comedian that I don't recommend, I don't know his name, but it was in my feed. And I watched this little blurb. It was just a short on YouTube. And he said, you think about what you're made of, because all matter is just molecules. It's just protons, neutrons, and electrons, just molecules. And between me and you, there is space, and that space is made up of what? Molecules. So how do these molecules know their lance? He made a joke around that. Well, it's actually a pretty profound question. How do my molecules know they're me? How do David's molecules know they're him? You know, when you look at trees and how trees grow, trees are almost perfectly balanced at their base. How do the branches on one side of that tree know to be offset by branches on the other side of that tree? They're just made of molecules. How do those molecules know to organize because of some strain in the root system of that tree that indicates, oh, we need some more growth over here? And it supplies it. And they wind up being almost perfectly balanced. And they're balanced to their environment, not just to the force of gravity. So if there's prevailing winds, they will grow in acknowledgement of those prevailing winds so that they can lean into the wind. Y'all driven down through Rockport and seen how the oak trees grow down there? Because there's always a southerly wind. They're all tilted to accommodate the wind so that they don't blow over. How do those molecules know to grow that way? Right? So it's a profound question. And we think we understand what this life is because we're living it and we occupy physical bodies and we're standing in a physical world and standing on physical ground. But the way that we are ordered, when you get down into the tiny bits There's some mind-blowing stuff in quantum mechanics, y'all. Some mind-blowing stuff. When you get into quantum physics and you get into the really tiny parts, there are some things that do not make sense. There are some things that even scientists label the God particle because they have no explanation for how certain things behave when you get small enough. So I'm reminded of a verse. Look at Hebrews chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. I think the Hebrew writer is touching on this very topic when he says, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets and in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. And he is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. How do my molecules know their Lance? How do David's molecules know they're David? Because God upholds all things by the words of his power. He organized it. He arranged it. He set in motion the physical properties that govern this world. The laws of physics are God's laws. He authored them. He created them through his Son. He spoke them into existence in all of their incalculable complexity. The smaller you get, the more complex it gets. And he authored all of that. And the reason I'm going to pains to explain that he upholds our existence, the organization of all that is, all matter, by the word of his power. He sustains it. We exist within that. Do we marvel at that? Because while we're marveling at that, it's going to pale in comparison to the spiritual world, whatever that word means. Because there are certain properties to our existence. When you break down all matter, it's protons, neutrons, and electrons. It's energy. Right? You organize energy in a particular way and you get matter and certain forms of matter. But since it's energy, all energy atrophies. So everything that's made of matter is in the process of disappearing before our eyes. Come back in 500 years and this wood table won't exist anymore. Come back in a few million years and I don't care if you've got diamonds in your pocket, they're dust. Right? So all matter is in the process of rotting away. But we're going to a permanent world. What's that going to look like? What's the next life going to look like when those physical properties of decay have been removed? It'll be something. And it's going to testify to his glory when we see it. So I think there's a lot being said in verse 2. Verse 3. And everyone who has this hope fixed on him purifies himself just as he is pure. We've talked a lot about what it means for God to give us an opportunity to purify ourselves. And that's what it is. It is an opportunity for us to be pure so that we can stand with him. But we have to make that choice. We've talked a lot about John throughout these three epistles and throughout his gospel. Was very binary in his choices. There are two paths. You're going to follow the Lord or you're going to follow Satan. You're doing good or you're of the devil. They're black and white binary choices over and over and over again. It's partly because of what he was dealing with in the time, the Gnosticism that was trying to find nuance everywhere to make those that hold those views feel smart and accomplished in their mental acuity, to find something new where something new shouldn't be found. So John is using these absolute terms, and as we get further into chapter 4, you'll see this even more and more. He's removing middle ground. But he's conveying in verse 3 here that there is an obligation that we have when we recognize God as our creator, when we recognize all that he has done, that there's more to that hope that we place in him than just expressing that hope. There is more to faith than simply acknowledging that God exists. there is action required. There is purification required. And it's not purification because God is standing in heaven with a check mark to see if we've checked certain boxes of compliance. No. These are necessities that through His grace He has created so that we can be pure and stand with Him in His purity without Him being compromised, without His perfection being tarnished. When somebody says, well, I don't believe I have to go through that step of baptism, that's a work of men. What they're saying is they expect a perfect, holy God to tarnish Himself by getting into the mud with them. Accept me for who I am is another way of saying, become what I am. It would not be God. His plea is that we avail ourselves of the opportunity to have that reconciliation, that we can be purified so that we can stand with Him. It's what He wants for us. He's not looking for an opportunity to strike us down. He's extending a hand to lift us up to every soul that hasn't done so. I think that's what He means in verse 3 when He says, and everyone who has this hope fixed on Him purifies himself just as He is pure. And I think there's something else suggested in there. Are we going to be without free will in heaven? We're going to be without free will? Are we going to be deprived of the opportunity to sin in heaven? Or will we simply not sin in heaven because being in His presence just precludes that possibility? When David?
When you go back and look in verse 2 again, and the phrase where He says, we shall be like Him. Well, if we're going to be like Him, we won't be sinning. What free will be like there, I don't know. But I don't get the idea even from descriptions in Revelation and the places that we're just going to be a bunch of robots. And but if we're going to be like Him, then that takes care of sin, because He cannot sin. And when we use that term "cannot sin," even that John uses here, it doesn't mean here on earth that we can't actually sin, because we do. But when we get there and we're like Him, sin is not a part of us anymore. And so, in that sense, and again, I don't know what free will will be like there. He hadn't told me. So,
John segues here into a discussion of sin. And I don't think that, again, it's through inspiration that we are provided these things. So one thought does lead to the other. So when we look at, what is going on with my, here we go. Turn to Romans chapter 4. Paul, by inspiration, says, for the law brings, in verse 15, for the law brings about wrath, but where there is no law, there is no violation. So Paul is making a logical point, as Paul often does, that sin only exists when there is something to violate. If there's no law to violate, there can be no sin, because how would you define wrong without defining right? You've got to define one in order to have the other. If you're going to have sin, there has to be something to transgress. So there has to be law. But when you look at, going back to John, chapter 3, beginning in verse 4, or 1 John, everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. Y'all know I'm a fan of the NASB 95. I think the NASB 95 does us a bit of a disservice for the English translation here. If you have a King James or a New King James, it would read, sin is the transgression of the law, rather than sin is lawlessness. I think that translation, frankly, is more in keeping with Paul's teaching in Romans chapter 4. There is a sense in when one who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. I think the meaning that John is conveying there, if you're choosing to walk the devil's path, you're ignoring God's law. I think that's what he means by lawlessness. But I think we need to understand these things in the context of other scriptures that give us clear understanding around it. That is part of the filter that we are to view Scripture through, that it is inerrant and contradictory. The Bible doesn't argue with itself. So when we see statements like this, that's when you know more study is required. Right? That's when you know you got to look for meaning in the context of other verses that teach on the same topic, and then understand the point that John is seeking to make here. Again, go back to the notion that John is going to make numerous binary statements that on their face might look contradictory with things that John himself has said in this same letter. John has made the point that all sin, and if we say we haven't sinned, we're a liar. And yet in just a few verses, he's going to say, if you sin, you're not of the Father, you're of the devil. All sin, but if you sin, you're of the devil. Is that contradictory? Or is there another meaning that we need to explore? Well, that's what this class is about. Yes, sir, Robert.
I think sometimes God's word is simple enough for us that we can take it from face value. Sin is sin. We know right from wrong. There's no in between. There's no partiality with him. It's either in or it's out. And so then, study the scripture like we've seen, look for the deeper meanings and all, we could come up with those conclusions or, all of that. But the bottom line is, we're either living righteously for him or unrighteously. So we're in Christ, we're in the kingdom of God through Christ, or we're outside. You have to, I think, sometimes just keep this, I can't say simple as that, but when things seem a little difficult, go straight right back to the basics.
I think that is exactly what John is getting at throughout the theme of this book. He is saying this is not a nuanced choice. This is a black and white choice. You're going to follow the Lord or you're going to follow the devil. You have two paths. There's only two. There's no quasi-redefinition of what the nature of deity is. There's no quasi-nuanced definition of what the nature of our Lord and his sacrifice was and is. He came in the flesh or he did not come. He came in the flesh or we have no hope of our own resurrection. These are the binary choices that he is giving. And again, it's a recognition of what was going on in that society. And it goes on in our society too, where folks cannot be happy with a plain black and white understanding of things. They have to bring their own opinion into it. They want to edify, they want to exemplify, magnify their own knowledge of things by finding things that aren't there and magnifying them. And then that's how false doctrine is born. That's how error is created. It's the reason it is so important for us to spend daily time in the Word. Verse 5, you know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him. Notice the tense of the phrasing here. No one who abides in him sins. Well, if we're abiding in him, while we are abiding in him, we're not sinning. Because if we're sinning, we're not actively abiding in him. So the statement's true, and it's non-contradictory with John's other teachings, but we need to understand what it means to abide in him. Part of abiding in him is when we stumble, We confess and repent of our sins, and he's faithful and just to forgive us. That's part of abiding in him. It's continually returning to him for the remedy that he's given to us. That's the nature of abiding in him. Josh, did you have a comment? Because I noticed that you looked.
I was trying to understand your point back in verse 4.
I'm reconciling verse 4 with Paul's statement in Romans 14. And again, it's more with the translation afforded us by the NASB here. Everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. Those 4 words, and sin is lawlessness, I think can be misunderstood, particularly in the context of what Paul says in Romans 4:15, that sin is a transgression of the law. There is law. There are things we are to do. There are things we're not to do. There are things we're to avoid. Those things are spelled out for us. I think it's a misunderstanding to say that sin is lawlessness, because without understanding what John means by lawlessness here, he doesn't mean there is no law. It means that one that practices a continual violation of the law is treating it as though there is no law. And in that way, it's lawless. Does that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what lawlessness means, is to transgress the law. So I was just confused if you were saying...
Well, some interpret it to mean that and they use this verse to show that there is no law. And I think that's a misapplication of this verse. Yes, sir?
Well, I'm looking at the word practices. That's the key.
Yes.
Because you go back to the first of the book.
It's a present tense verse.
Walking in the light as he is in the light. You're walking. You're living your life a certain way. It's the way you carry yourself, the way you live your life. You make choices every day. You choose to be like Christ. You make that choice every day, many times. And that's what practicing walking is. Because you're going to stumble, yes, but you got to pick yourself up. That's not the way you're living your life. Now this would indicate that, okay, you're pursuing sin. Like you were saying, you are living a life of sin. Well, that's because you're choosing to live in darkness. You're pushing the light away.
It's that back to that binary.
Comparison. How are you walking? How is your walk going? You know?
Because you're going to walk a path.
That's right.
And which path are you going to choose?
And
This is,
coming up in verse 8, he uses that same practices sin again.
Yes.
So
a continuing present action.
yeah,
Yes.
interpretation of this whole passage is it's not that if we're abiding in Christ that we're not going to sin, but we're not going to practice it,
It doesn't say he who has never sinned, or has ever sinned, rather.
or that we will never sin again.
Right. It's he who practices sin. Currently engaged in it, choosing to walk that pathway, forsaking the Lord. That binary choice.
But while
Doesn't-
we are abiding in Christ, we won't sin. We can vary off of that, I think, in my opinion, we can vary off of that, get right back in the way, because that would happen.
Because he's given us provision for that, and that is
Yes,
kind of the circular nature of abiding.
and grace.
Does anybody have a King James or a New King James version that they can read from for verse 4? I just want to make sure that I'm making myself clear on.
Well, the New King James says sin is lawlessness.
Okay, what about the King James?
The Old King James says.
Anybody still carry an Old King James? I'm going to be proud of you if you do, because from a nostalgia standpoint. Go ahead.
Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth against also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law.
I think that translation affords less confusion on this topic. Yes, ma'am.
In my King James, it says, "And for whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness."
Right. that we're defining a characteristic of somebody that is ignoring God's precepts. This is a descriptive phrase of the person that engages in that. It's not a statement that there's no law to violate. But we spent way more time on that than I had expected. Verse 5, you know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him. To Beverly's point, no one who abides in him sins. That's a present tense action. It's a continual action. We're abiding in him, we're not sinning. And we need to understand that when we do sin, we're no longer abiding in him. We should put a spotlight on the notion that we are no longer on the right path. We got to get back on the right path. And he's made provision for that. And those provisions are contained within abiding with him. That's where his grace lives. Verse 7, little children, make sure no one deceives you. The one who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. Again, same point again. One that practices righteousness, actively, continually doing so. It's not enough for us to simply avoid evil. If we're not practicing righteousness, we're not avoiding evil. There is a proactive nature to practicing righteousness. It requires something of us more than just avoiding overt sin. It reclassifies what sin is. Because if we're not proactively practicing righteousness, and he's about to define further what that is, it's loving one another in this life. In the context of John's teaching in this chapter, he continually comes back to that. If we don't catch ourselves continually doing good for other people, we need to look at what path we're on. It's a daily walk. There's caution in here. Little children, make sure that no one deceives you. The one who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. He's giving us a measuring stick. He's giving us a check valve on our actions. Be mindful of what you do and who you're doing it for and why. Verse 8, again, these binary statements. The one who practices sin is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. The Son of God appeared for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. You deprive the devil any actions, he's powerless. If our righteousness keeps us on a path that walks in the opposite direction of his path, he's powerless. He's totally ineffective. His effectiveness is destroyed at that point. Robert?
That last wish you read, it's just so true that if we're not doing things righteously and we're not consciously evaluating ourselves and the things we do on a daily basis, all day long sometimes, because you know who you are, better than anyone else, then it lays room for the devil to creep in. And when he starts creeping in, that's when your guard comes down. And some things that, it's kind of borderline to you, begins to be more acceptable to you. You know what I mean? And so you're practicing righteousness, but you're not really living righteously in all things of Christ. Because you're got some things that's implanted that makes you think it's okay. Because you're using your own understanding and not the understanding that God has supplied.
I think that is getting at the very heart of what John is teaching here, because that's exactly what the people that he's talking to are doing. I think that's something we can safely infer by the use of these continually black and white statements and our understanding just through looking at secular history of the issues they were dealing with regard specifically to Gnosticism at this time. Verse 9, no one who is born of God practices sin because his seed abides in him. and he cannot sin because he's born of God. I think this gets back to the conversation we were having earlier about what free will looks like in heaven. When our revelation of God is complete, when our understanding is complete, when we see him as he is, when we are transformed to be like he is in his spiritual state, whatever that will look like for us when we're there, no one who is born of God practices sin because his seed abides in him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. I think that has particular application to that next life, to David's point. What does that mean with regard to free will? I think it means that once we have a full grasping of exactly the nature of God in that day, sin has no place in us. It'll just have no place. It'll have no space left. There won't be any room for it. And the broader point that he's making here is if we're walking God's path, there's no deviating. It's not curved. It doesn't twist. It's defined. And if we're truly born of God, both in this life and in the next, if we're truly born of God, we will seek to stay on that path. And if we're always looking for an off-ramp, that's our choice. And John continually presents it as a choice. Verse 10, by this the children of God and the children of the devil are obvious. Anyone who does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor the one who does not love his brother. I would say it becomes extremely important for us to understand what it means to love our brother. So what does it mean to love our brother? John emphasizes this point. I haven't counted it, but it would be interesting to see how many times love of brethren is emphasized in John's writings. It'd be an astonishing number. So what does that mean? Let's get some examples of what that means. First and foremost, what does it mean?
Well, we can't love God if we're not willing to love our brother. I mean, Jesus gave that example to his disciples when he washed their feet, and he was explaining to them about certain and that God being love, loving us enough to give his own son. That's the example that we have, and so we can't be like him if we're not willing to give that kind of love.
So our love is to have, there's a humility aspect to our love.
Absolutely.
That there should be no barriers that say, I'm here on the status level, they're here. I'll help the folks up here that need it. I'll give them sound accounting advice. I'll give them great investment tips. They'll be my neighbor. I'll mow their side yard on Sunday morning, but these folks down here, that's somebody else's job. And I think that was a message that the Lord was sending in part. There is no status in God's kingdom. Right?
The woman at the well, I mean, that's a perfect example.
Yes. Every soul has identical worth. Every soul has identical worth. So first and foremost, we would want those people in our lives, our brothers, to be saved. I would think that needs to be starting block number one. That needs to be our most foundational default. We want them to understand what it means to stand in God's light. We want them to see the benefits of that. We want them to yield obedience to him. We want them to be added to his kingdom by him. So I think that's the first aspect of love. But people also have physical needs in this life. Who's supposed to tend to them? Well, Hebrews chapter 10, y'all, the whole chapter is about why we congregate for that very purpose, so that we can be aware. Yes, we are to lift our voices together. We are to worship him as he has prescribed for us to do. But can you worship alone? Can. We occasionally are. But is there a tangible benefit for us congregating together? Yeah. We become involved in each other's lives, or at least we should, so that we can tend to the needs of one another. And this congregation does an amazing job of that. I don't think anyone has ever sat at home wondering where their brothers and sisters are if they're in genuine need in this congregation. If that's occurred, I'm not aware of it.
Having one another up gives you perspective too, because you can look at your own life and see your challenges, but when you have your brethren and you see them in challenges way far beyond yours, you start to realize your blessings more, and helping others out, helping those in need out, in your brethren especially, is a great blessing.
One of the things we're going to talk about tonight in the congregational meeting is how productive some of the preachers that we support. You look at David in India. I went back and looked at a couple of years of emails from him that we've traded back and forth, and he's baptizing a little over 40 people a year. A lot of them are denominational preachers that he's becoming in contact with because they share the same space and they're walking some of the same paths and they're addressing the same groups of people, and he's pulling those people aside into studies. And they're becoming persuasive of the doctrinal error that brought them there. And he's teaching them the truth, and they're responding to it. And it's partly because they don't enjoy the physical blessings to the degree we do in this country. They have more need. They rely on each other in a very physical way. So there's a different pull and a different meaning for them in that setting, just from a societal standpoint, for what it means to congregate and to be part of each other's lives, because they have to physically care for each other in a way that we're blessed to not necessarily have to do here. So how do we fulfill that obligation? Because the obligation for us is exactly the same as it is for them. So how do we fulfill that obligation to love our brother when the physical needs aren't as dire? Because a second ago I said I'm not aware of any occasion where somebody's physical needs weren't met by this body. But I am aware of situations where emotional needs weren't noticed and attended to, and it led to hurt and some pain from those individuals. There's individuals that have shared with us in confidence, went through a really rough period of time. Didn't hear from anybody. Well, their need wasn't physical. It wasn't necessarily financial. They had food, they had shelter, they had water, they had the fundamentals of life. But how important it would have been for certain individuals to get a text that said, hey, I know you're going through a rough patch. Love you. Please let me know what I can do. I'm here to talk. Just the littlest things like that, to let people know that we love them. They mean a lot, y'all. And it's so easy now. If y'all don't have the church directory on your phone, please see me or one of the deacons or David so that it can be added. Because when you pull up the church directory, it has everybody listed. It has all of their contact information, and they're all hyperlinks. So if you want to send somebody an encouraging text, you literally touch their picture, touch their cell phone, and it even has message there. You don't even have to open your chat box on your phone. You just hit message, and you can send them a message straight from the directory app. It's a great tool, y'all. So in any event, we will finish up this quarter next week. Thank you all for your comments.
Good morning. This morning, before we get started, Russell Thompson will be our song leader this morning. In a few minutes, Pete Williams will have our closing prayer, and Robbie Jenkins will have our closing prayer at the end of worship. Jeannie Wright sent a message this morning. Her doctor started her on a new blood pressure medication, and it's taken it way too low. So she was not feeling well because of that. She's not going to take it today and hoping to be here tonight, but she said her arthritis is a little bit flared too. So we'll see if Jenny will be here tonight, but keep her in your prayers that they can get her medication figured out. Sherry Davenport was